Belongs to those who adapt, those who identify shortcomings and unlock value.
A quantum leap was necessary.
I think you understate the situation. It isn't necessary. It's essential if we're to build any kind of a future.
We have to ask ourselves, what can we do to invest in the right places for the right reasons? Not because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the only thing to do.
I've often heard leaders say we are walking into a brave, brand new world. Some say we're already living in it. What is this brave new world? It's one that's cleaner, greener, and safer. It is one that's more socially just and equitable. It's one where there's economic distribution that is fairer. This is a world of technological advancements driven by designs from Tesla, Apple, Google, Alibaba. It's one where farmers are thinking outside the box, doing big things like farming on city rooftops and using hydroponics to produce food. It's one where banks, telcos, and insurers have thought about financial inclusion and have come up with the necessary technological advancements such as fintech to create opportunities for all people to transact. This brave new world is the one that eco warriors have been calling for at the climate summit in Glasgow, holding leaders accountable to create a future that is more imaginative. And so, on this edition of Critical Conversations brought to you by Sanlam Investments, we are reimagining that future. We are considering that brave new world, and we are asking, when everybody does their bit, what kind of change will it yield? And what does that change look like? Is it small steps or giant leaps for humankind? It's that future of the next 50 to 100 years. We may not be there, but we can definitely harness the change today for the generations to come. Now, we want to encourage you to join the conversation, and you can do so on social media. We're on Twitter and on LinkedIn. Please use the hashtag Critical Conversations, and then also tag us at Sanlam Invest. Hashtag Critical Conversations. It is a conversation brought to you by Sanlam Investments. Let's get talking, and let me introduce to you our bold, brave panelists. They are Nancy Giordano, who is a strategic futurist. Her areas of interest are broad, but she loves tech, digitalization, and also just ideas of how to reinvent the economy and society at large. She's joined by Rose Phillips, who's an Africa-focused futurist. She's also the executive director of GIBS, the Gordon Institute for Business Sciences. And Rose is going to speak to us around a range of issues, but issues that merge questions of social justice and community with technology and also governance as well as the environment. They all come together. Glenn Silverman is an investment strategist at Riskura, and he's going to show us all about how the money can be deployed using bolder investment strategies and just more creative portfolio management and making sure that really the money is being constructively used. And also another money man is Nersin Naidu. He's the CEO of Sanlam Investments, and obviously with Sanlam managing billions in pension savings and investments, his passion lies in how to use this money to do good. So, without further ado, let's get talking, ladies and gentlemen, and the warmest welcome to this very third edition of Critical Conversations brought to you by Sanlam Investments. So I think what I want to do is ask you all a question, quick fire. I'd like the quickest, shortest answer, but just get us thinking as to what the real themes are. If I said to you, Nancy, in the United States, I'd like you to reimagine the future, look into your crystal ball, supported by a few facts, of course, but what does that future over the next 50 to 100 years look like?
I think actually much shorter. We are transitioning right now from the industrial era into, I strongly and firmly believe, an exponential productivity revolution in which we can create more with less, which creates the opportunity for a safe and thriving future for us all.
Glenn, what does that future look like?
Yeah, predicting the future is always scary. So I think looking to your crystal ball means it comes with risk. And I'm going to take a bit of a risk approach to this. So I know Nurson's the eternal optimist, and I'm going to just try to challenge some of those going forward. I think we have some challenges. There's risk and opportunity, and we're going to discuss that a bit more.
Rose, look into your crystal ball.
Yeah, Glenn is going the risk route. I'm going the people route. I'd like to see a future where everyone can participate, that is planet friendly, and that those generations who live in that future can look back on today and say to their ancestors, us, thank you, job well done.
When you're an ancestor, what is the world going to look like?
Look, I think if you're sitting here today and you're looking forward, you can either have a very dim view of what's going to come, or you can have a very optimistic view of what's going to come. As Glenn said, I'm an optimist. I like to believe that we are all going to collectively get our act together, and that we're going to end up in a very sustainable and exciting world in future.
We stay with the quick fire. Nancy, a single critical step that needs to be taken to ensure sustainability in the future. Glenn? Rose?
Nothing about us without us. So develop skills for our people, make sure that the future that we create, they can actually keep sustainable.
And Nelson?
I'm going to go with a more general one. I'm going to say urgency. I think there's a high need for urgency at this moment to start moving this agenda forward at a much more rapid pace.
Okay, so from what I'm getting from you, we need to think bolder, we need to deploy capital in a more constructive way, we need to remember to put people at the heart of it all. Let's see what you think, all of you, our delegates and our guests on this virtual platform today. I'm going to ask you a question by way of a poll. Please vote, tell us what you think, and that will guide us as we begin going through some of the really broad themes around this question of sustainability over the next 50 to 80 years, and the important small steps and the giant leaps that must be taken. So the poll question is this: how long will it take for South Africa in particular to become sustainable, economically prosperous, and self-reliant? Will it take 5 years, 10 years, 30 years? Not in my lifetime. Or I haven't thought about it. What is the answer? 5 years, 10 years, 30 years? It's not going to happen whilst you live. You haven't really given it a thought as to what's going to make South Africa more sustainable, economically prosperous for all people, and also self-reliant. Vote now. I'm going to use the liberty to also vote. And let's see what the results look like as they come through. Okay, so 3% of you say South Africa is not going to be sustainable over the next 5 years. That's what I can garner from 3% of people voting. 39% of you say it's not going to happen in your lifetime, so a little bit more skeptical there. 37% of you, so just more than a third of you, say it will happen in the next 30 years. And 18% of you say, yeah, perhaps in the next decade. A few of you haven't really thought about it. But it just seems as though from the polls, ladies and gentlemen, many people believe this sustainable, economically prosperous, self-reliant future, certainly for the South African case, is not going to happen in their lifetime. And then another third say, okay, maybe 30 years is a good benchmark to use. And I think that helps us get into the very first of our sub-themes: a sustainable future, one generation later. Nancy, by way of asking you to enter the conversation, I'm going to remind our guests and viewers of a quote. It's not quite a quote, I'll paraphrase something that was once said, is when you're sitting under a tree and enjoying the shade, you must remember that 5, 10, 15, even 100 years ago, somebody had the thought to plant that tree for you. We are the people who today can plant a tree for a stranger in the future to sit under that tree and enjoy the shade. So, how do we create it, Nancy, for one generation later, a sustainable future? Mm. Mm. Okay. Okay, so from those 5 pillars, I just want to hone in on two things you've raised, Nancy. Firstly, I want to know, how do we get people to embrace a climate consciousness? So, in everything that we do, to think about the planet. Yeah. And you've raised a second issue when you talk about systemic biases and social justice. I mean, in South Africa in particular, we had a moment, a cataclysmic moment in July, where all of a sudden inequality was staring everybody in the face through civil unrest and protests. And we've actually seen pockets and hotspots across the world of flare ups. What needs to happen to start addressing these systemic biases? I mean, in South Africa, we talk about it in terms of race and then the economy, but there are many other ways in which marginalization shows up. Right, right. Mm, right. Glenn, I want to bring you into the conversation because obviously we're talking about the tangibles, the planet. We can see it changing, healing. We're talking about humanity. We engage. What are the things we're missing, the intangibles, but things that we must be aware of in terms of the kinds of shifts that are taking place before us? Mm. And who's responsible, Glenn? I mean, at the moment, we see the conversation is dominated, say, by a China and an America, and then the rest of us are somewhere in the middle of this whole thing. Mm. Yeah. Okay, shifting balances of power, Rose, and one of the fundamental shifts is this youth dividend that Nancy referenced. These are the consumers of the future, and they've got things to say.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the one trend that I also just want to add to what Nancy's been saying is the concentration of wealth. And that is a problem. The concentration of wealth creates disillusionment for our young people. And what she said 25%, 49% of people will be under 25. They will be African. So African young people are a demographic dividend, absolutely, but they are discontented. And we've seen it, the Arab Springs, you've referenced our Tea Party in KZN. We had Marikana, we had Fees Must Fall. And I'm very concerned because our young people can, in a sense, be productive. They can perform, they can provide innovations, they can solve this and provide solutions for the problems that we have. But they can also become destructive because of disillusionment, because of indignity. Because economic exclusion is one thing, but social exclusion, that's invisibility. And invisibility can create destruction.
Nelson, let's remind us of the subheading for this particular part of the conversation, a sustainable future, one generation later. You know, when we speak one generation later, you know, I'm talking in 50-year terms, but actually that generation's already been born.
Yep.
What do they expect of us?
Yeah, look, there, I think you can see it if you look at the audiences at, you know, COP26 or the previous COPs. If you think about people, the young activists, Greta Thunberg, you know, it's the young generation are really speaking out loudly now and telling us as the current generation, you know, the ones who are going to plant the trees, as you referenced earlier, that we aren't doing enough. You know, we simply aren't doing enough, and that there's not enough urgency. And I guess there's some truth in that. You know, if I pick up on Rosa's point on concentration of wealth, you know, if you think about concentration of wealth, we've operated in a system probably for 250 years where capitalism has served us really well, and ultimately probably led to this problem of the concentration of wealth, which I think now to some degree limits the tools that are available to governments and regulators to actually, you know, get us moving in a different direction now, which is why the private sector has to come in quite aggressively, but also then, you know, society as a whole has to get a lot more engaged in this problem. And I think that is what the youth are actually calling for, is a general conscious movement for all of us to get involved to trying to actually solve some of these problems.
Okay, so you've given me sort of 3 dimensions of stakeholders. There's business, government, and then we've talked about civil engagement. But there's still a question, who really carries the responsibility for creating the sustainable future?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, that, and I think, you know, I think the answer is everybody is looking for the answer, or everybody wants us to give the tangible answer to that. I think you have to think about what's happening in the world today, and you know, you see a lot of nationalist, protectionist action. We're moving away from globalization. people, again, because of the inequalities and all of the challenges that we're facing, you referred to the Tea Party in KZN.
Yeah.
We're going to see more and more of that. You think about Brexit, people protecting their own jobs, British jobs for British people. These are all social issues that are materializing, forcing very nationalist agendas and people becoming very, focused on their own specific countries or issues and agendas. The challenge we have, on the other hand, is that this sustainability challenge is not one that can be solved with that kind of an approach.
Right.
We need a lot more of a global solution to this. We all have to come together and work together. So when you ask who's responsible for it, it's not any one of those stakeholders that we refer to. It's not the governments and regulators. It's not the private sector. It's not the man on the street. Individually who's carrying the responsibility for it. It's all of us collectively, but it really is all of us collectively in a global sense that has to get together now and align around this agenda of solving this problem.
Rose, often, and I'm just oversimplifying here, but often when we use the word sustainability, people just imagine we're talking about the environment. Make it clean, cream clean, whatever, I'm messing it up, but make it green and clean. But give me a broader definition of sustainability.
Yeah, sustainability, and actually if you think about ESG, is about the environment, so really it is about the planet and it's about climate, but it's also about governance, making sure that we have the frameworks in place and the transparency to govern properly and reduce corruption. And then thirdly, and one that I'm very, very passionate about, is social. And the social inequalities that we deal with, it's not all related to money. We have structural and institutional inequalities that have been created by discrimination, whether it's against women, whether it's against black people, ethnic minorities across the world, whether it's religious. So all of those social inequalities we have to address. And those social inequalities mostly then translate into people being poorer. And what's really, really a concern is if you think about environment and you think, well, environment is only one issue, they are all interrelated because social issues, especially for the poor, the most vulnerable, they're going to suffer even more than anyone else because the temperature is rising so fast. And in Africa, the temperature is rising even faster than the rest of the world.
So there's a confluence of all these issues. Okay, there's some questions coming through from the virtual forum. And this question from Anonymous says, when will tribal authorities be included in the dialogue with regards to the regulation of land in rural areas? And then Anonymous adds, a clear jurisdiction between the government and tribal authorities is required because citizens use this as a loophole to acquire land cheaply. Long term, this will result in the continual loss of biodiversity. I see quite a few issues in this one. It's the rural-urban issue. It's the jurisdiction over tribal lands versus the land that the government owns, and then it's the use of that land. Who wants to hazard an attempt at this question?
Okay, so I think it's a very difficult question to answer. You can't, I can't venture into the realm of how you raise the interaction around the jurisdiction over tribal land. There was a point there around biodiversity. I think the first thing one can point to there is that in terms of all of the the various challenges that we're trying to address from a sustainability perspective, if you look at a lot of the research out there, biodiversity is the one that we're paying the least attention to. It's the one we're underperforming the most on. That's a material problem. But I think in terms of this specific issue around, I won't tackle the point in terms of how do you get that interaction better. But I think the one thing that we all need to be aware of is these types of interactions, whether they be between government and tribal leaders or governments and business, need to start happening on a much more fast-track basis. I'll point very quickly to the pandemic. We produced a vaccine there within 10 months. We wouldn't have been able to do that if we didn't have the fast-tracking of approvals, testing, a lot more risk appetite. And I think if we're going to solve the challenge referred to in the question, but more generally these issues, then you have to have a change in the way we approach the process of engagement, risk appetite, approvals, all of those things which tend to take a long time now.
Nancy, I saw you nodding there, and I'm just going to really pigeonhole you like an American. right now, because obviously America's also grappled with many of these issues, the biodiversity issue, but also the inclusion of indigenous communities in the political mainstream. These have been really very, very topical issues. So let's talk about that. Rural, urban, marginalized indigenous communities who were there first, and then also using the land constructively around ownership, but also farming or development. Mm, mm, right, right. Okay, it's time for us to move on to our second pillar and our second sub-theme for the day, and this one is titled Investing in the Future That We Need. Nursing, I have a few questions for you, but actually I'm going to start with another question that's coming through on the virtual platform, and I think it will create a great segue for us. Again, it's anonymous. I wish you guys would just tell us who you are. Then we can say it's Tap or it's Jessica or it's Peter. But Anonymous wants to know, what are the current spending habits in households that can be used as a proxy to determine whether sustainability goals will be reached? So the behavior at household level. And then Anonymous adds, if a household is defined by high levels of consumerism, irrespective of net income, so in other words, these South Africans who are said to be in debt to the tune of 70% of their income, what change in attitude is required that will bode well also for capitalism? So we recognize we need the consumerism, but what's responsible consumerism?
Yeah, we've got quite an engaged audience today. So I think, okay, so the first thing is, if you think about household behavior, right? I think we do have a big problem. So we are very much in a very consumer led type of environment, and specifically, I'll talk about a couple of things. One, energy and water. And if you think about how we consume those two very scarce resources in South Africa compared to other parts of the world, here in Cape Town, we almost ran out of water a few years ago. And if you just think about how we had to change our behaviors and the very material differences that you can make if you adopt a more sustainable approach to water as a resource, you can make very material differences. In a household, you can do simple things like change your electricity consumption by using LED lights in your house, thinking about the way you use your geysers and how you power your geysers, thinking about how you generally use electricity more sparingly. So I think we do adopt an approach of excess there. Food wastage is the other one I want to touch on. I think at the moment we've got a massive problem with food wastage. We don't have we are well past the carrying capacity of the planet. There's too many hungry people. Tonight 2 billion people will be hungry. There's about a 30% food wastage. If we can't start addressing food wastage, and that sits in households at the moment. A lot of that food wastage does sit in households. Then we aren't going to be able to make any headway on this. And I mean, you asked earlier for what the definition of sustainability is. I'll give you what I've heard to be one of the better definitions of sustainability for me, which I think touches on this point. It is humanity's response to protecting us from human excess.
Yeah.
Okay, and this point that's been raised about consumerism and things is all a function of human excess, and the only way we're going to get anywhere with all of this is if we take steps back from human excess.
I just want to bring Glenn into the conversation. I'd like to bring Glenn into the conversation here because you actually used the word greed in your earlier statement. And here are three words that are aligned with the business of business. Consumerism, you need a market. Capitalism, you need a free market, but it's creating this human excess that Nersen is talking about. So what's the balancing act here? Mm, 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 mm. Nancy? Yeah, right. Mm, right, right. Okay, I want Nersen to continue to guide us here as we talk about investing in the future we need. As asset managers, pension funds, you're managing people's savings. You can deploy this capital. How do you deploy it in a meaningful way? In a way where at least business can start to think about these broad questions of sustainability?
Okay, let's start with the asset manager first before we get to the asset owner. So I think if you start with the asset manager, you can think about the world in which asset managers deploy capital simply along two lines: private markets and public markets. In the public markets, it's about using these ESG frameworks to engage with companies. So I think the old school way of doing it was saying if you don't like mining companies, then you simply disinvest from them. You don't hold them in a portfolio.
Yeah.
The newer more current way of thinking about it is that you have to be a very active owner. So stewardship, if you're investing asset owners' money into these companies, you actively engage with them, get them to change their behaviors, get them to set agendas for what they want to do, and
Right.
measure them and hold them accountable to that. So that's broadly speaking, what we do from a listed market perspective. When you get into the private markets, it's really about how you make an impact. So where you're deploying the capital to make impact, that might be in things like relating to social issues, so affordable housing, general property impact strategies, infrastructure, private equity to create jobs, SME debt funding to ensure that small businesses are growing and able to create more jobs, and the economy grows from that. So that's all about deploying capital into high impact areas that are going to contribute either to social or environmental issues. And thinking about things like renewable energy, building solar and wind powered power stations and those kind of things. So from an asset manager's perspective, I think you have to first tilt your focus a little bit to say, yes, we are here to deliver financial returns, but over and above that, we are here to deliver on impact. So you have to be led by some purpose that's greater than just delivering financial returns for your clients. It's also about deploying that capital to make an impact.
So there's a mindset shift, and I know that there's a lot of attention focused on ESG, environment, social, and governance issues as kind of setting the framework, the parameters for where money can be deployed. Can you talk us through how the asset management industry has embraced ESG philosophies and targets, and whether or not it's working? And I think the question I'm really asking here is, if there wasn't ESG, if there weren't these global norms and standards, would people be doing it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I think if we're honest, the answer is probably no. So if you think back to what was it, the early 1970s, United Nations Environmental Program Indira Gandhi addressed the UNEP, and then at that point started to make the point that we've got a massive sustainability problem. That was before we'd even got to the point where the Earth couldn't carry the population anymore. It's now 50 years on from that, and we're finally starting to take the conversation a lot more seriously, engage in discussions like this, and talk about it. I think there's been a lot that's happened in the last few years that have raised the level of awareness around this, and we are moving in the direction. But I think this question of whether it's a good conversation now and how much it translates into action is a good one, and it probably hasn't translated into enough action yet in terms of how it's embraced holistically. When do we get to the point where all investments are managed either through ESG frameworks or impact investing lenses? It's very difficult to answer that question, but we are still a long way off from there.
Rose, I want to bring you into the conversation because I think what I'm getting at here is the carrot and stick. For people to do the right thing, somebody needs to be lording it over them. And yet we're talking here about something that should just be intuitive, natural, that you should want to invest in the right things.
I know. We should recognize that doing good is good business, right? Yeah, and it is. And we really shouldn't have to have a moral imperative only. We should be able to have business cases. Right now, we have political mandates driving our decisions. So yes, it is the stick. But what we need more than that is science. We need data that tells us where are we going wrong, what is the impact, so that we actually realize that the problem is real. But what I'm encouraged by, though, talking about our young people, they are connected. More of them are actually becoming retail investors, Nelson. Our women, as more women enter the workforce, they are becoming retail investors. And they care about impact. They care about purpose. So I think it's not just going to be profit and purpose, which is what we are hearing now as the new mantra. We're going to see profit through purpose. But we're going to need science and data to help us understand what really are the impacts so that we can understand how real they are.
And very briefly, Rose, the existing data, no matter how scant, what is it telling us about where there are great opportunities to invest within the sustainable framework and where you can also make money?
So I think within the context of Africa, we have to industrialize. And I'm going to stick to the African continent. We have to industrialize, but we have to industrialize in a green way. So if you just think about where our polluters are, and yes, Africa is a very small polluter compared to the rest of the world. But if you think about where our pollution sits, is in energy, and it's in manufacturing. And we can actually lead the way because we don't have a lot of the legacy challenges that some of other industries have and other countries and continents have where they've got stranded assets. So we must not invest in stranded assets. So I would say, for example, agriculture, because we've got 60% of arable land on this continent. So let's go there. Let's think about biofuels. Let's think about protein alternatives. We can invest in that. Let's think about electrical vehicles. We've just signed, or COP has just signed, 100 entities working together to reduce internal combustion engine utilization. We can be manufacturers of two-wheeled vehicles, three-wheeled, four-wheeled vehicles that are energy efficient. And then I would go to solar and wind turbines. We're going to have to produce that. The world is going to need that. We can test those things throughout the year because we've got a lot of sun. So I think that there are absolutely opportunities in various industries where if we focus our energy, we can invest and we can see the change.
Okay, we'll talk about investment strategies in a second. I want to bring you into the conversation, Glenn, just to the point that's just been made about the carrots and sticks, the protocols, the targets. You can monitor what's happening in the listed space. The question is monitoring what's happening in the private space. And this is really challenging because what can't be seen can't be held accountable. Mm. Wow. Mm. Right. 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 And very quickly, please answer Phil Bartman's question for me, Glenn. Phil Bartman from Phil Bar Consulting says there seems to be a battle looming over double materiality, with the newly formed International Sustainability Standards Board pushing for ESG with an enterprise value focus only or an enterprise value focus only, and sustainability pragmatists pushing to include companies' impact on the environment and society. So basically the question is, will smart capital flow towards companies that recognize double materiality, or will EV, enterprise value, continue to be the primary concern? Mm, right. Nancy, this one's directed to you. Right. Right. Nancy, I'm staying with you. Here's a question. It's very Africa focused, but I'd like you to refer to international best practice. It's a question from Veli Mukwena, and Veli says, when are we going to see the list of countries on the continent listing what each country's strategy is towards sustainability? What are they achieving, where they lag, what corrective actions are taking place? And then Veli says, a concern is in South Africa we use landfills, yet the UN deadline has passed and we should be recycling by now. So basically, without going into the specificities of what's happening in each African country, just what are the lessons that can be learned internationally of how to take those international protocols and start to infuse them into policy and government strategy? Mm. Yeah. Mm. Right. Right. Okay. And just go ahead. Right. Right. Okay. I want to move this conversation along, but not before Nersin answers this question. Anonymous. As asset managers investing the funds of the wealthy minority, Is Sanlam able to use its core expertise to address the country's broader inequality problems?
Yeah, so look, I think the answer to that is yes, but not singularly. So in terms of some of the social challenges and how we deploy capital to address those, um, let's think about job creation, as one example. So, we know to get economic growth going in South Africa, we have to create a lot more jobs. I think we spoke in the first critical conversations quite a bit about job creation initiatives. We spoke then about some of the funds that we had launched with Sanlam putting their own capital behind it firstly, and then raising capital around it. One from wealthy individuals, but also from other institutional retirement funds whose members' capital come into the things. So we are absolutely able to and do focus on something like job creation to address some of these social challenges in South Africa, but our impact is small relative to the total challenge, and it requires quite a material mobilization of the broader industry, to do similar things and to start addressing some of these challenges and put to work all capital and create models that incentivize capital to come in to start addressing these challenges. And if you think about what Glenn referred to earlier, in terms of that small e, non-existent S and big G, then that's a clear sign that we've still got a long way to go before we get a material mobilization, to deal with this issue.
Yeah, it's quite an indictment there, the small e, no SG. Thank you so much to our audience and delegates for being so engaging in this third edition of Critical Conversations. We're talking sustainability over the next 50 to 100 years. Do we need small steps or do we need big, bold, giant leaps? Continue to talk, hashtag Critical Conversations. We'd like to ask you a second question, just by way of a poll. Who is responsible for driving sustainability? In your opinion, who needs to take this on as their mantra, as their focus? Answer the questions now. Let's have a look at the poll that's coming through. And some of the options: policymakers, investors, industrialists. Who do you think is responsible for telling us and for taking on this agenda? I will wait for the results to come through in just a second. And whilst we're doing that, perhaps it's a great time to tee up just a small little break so that we can continue having this conversation. Okay, the results are coming through. Who's responsible for driving sustainability? Is it policymakers? 8% of you say it's so. Is it industry and big business? Marginal difference. 9% say it's them. Investors, 2%. So not everybody's holding you accountable there, Nerson. Consumers, no. South Africans are going to continue shopping. 3% of them say we're not stopping. And then all of the above, 79% say it's a collective effort, all hands on deck. The policymakers need to be here, industry needs to be here, investors need to be here, consumers need to be here. Glenn, somebody really wants to get in touch with you, and we're going to continue with this conversation in a second. Finally telling us his name. Okay, listen, when you nurture confidence, it leads to courageous actions. And today we're talking about courageous actions because these are the traits of a new generation. They want bold action, they want answers now. And I think it's when we're courageous, when we're confident, that the values start to change in business. And these are the values that are needed, that business needs to embrace in order to help the next generation. Let's show you how. all about investing confidently. You're watching Critical Conversations brought to you by Sanlam Investments, thinking about a future. Some say a future that's already upon us. Others say the one we can invest in today for generations to come. Do we need baby steps, small steps, or giant leaps? That is the focus of our conversation. And our sub-theme now is the investor of the future, defining who that investor of the future is, and perhaps even looking at the investment strategies that can be employed to address the question of sustainability in the future. Before I ask Glenn to start carving out some thoughts for us, let me just read to you some comments that are coming through. Some are quite cheeky, but I guess it does speak to the challenges of the day. Hanley Kolber says, sorry, I lost you all for a second there because of load shedding. So here we are, the lights are out, and we are talking about sustainability. You know, flies in the face of what we're trying to achieve here. Anonymous says, so far I've heard nothing about population growth, which hit the poor the most, but they are the greatest contributors. Actually, that's not fair, Anonymous. Nelson did refer to the fact that in terms of capacity, there are too many people living on planet Earth, and the Earth can't sustain it anymore, and that's why we're having this conversation. But population growth, ladies and gentlemen, could we think about that? And Bala Mudise says, I think the issue on high and increased inequality between North and South, white and black, so it's geographic, men and women, it's gender specific, makes it difficult to see how the disadvantaged should commit to a cleaner environment when wealthy countries, the North and the South, have done that for centuries. So perhaps we can think about these global divisions in our next conversation. Okay, so Glenn Silverman, who is the investor of the future? I say they are millennials, they are Gen Zs, they are discerning, they want transparency, they want accountability, they want traceability, and they want purpose. How do you start to cater for them?
Yeah, well, starting point is I'd agree. Obviously, that is the investor of the future. And the good news or the interesting news or the big news is the fact that 30 trillion US dollars is going to move from the baby boomers, this current generation, over the next 2 decades towards exactly the new investors. And they see the world very, very differently. They are, as you say, in tune with the ESG space. They demand this in the investment strategies, and hence, and the comment that in 10 years' time, everything will be ESG, even if not green, but certainly driven by all those principles. So that's the good news. We're moving in that direction. Those investors will demand it, and it'll be a question of them demanding certain product that meets their needs, or asset managers and others creating product which they presume will do exactly the same.
Behavioral scientists, Glenn, talk about a lot of things, but in common parlance these days, I hear people talking about embracing a prosperity mindset, and then others juxtapose it to a scarcity mindset. How do we gear people towards a mindset that is aspirational, says, yes, it's good to want prosperity, but link it to people, to the planet, and to a broader purpose?
I think that's a great question, and I think that is really, really a key challenge. And this whole thing about an abundance mentality and then scarcity mentality really does come to the fore. I think the best way to answer this is referenced in your earlier introduction about someone saying we've got load shedding, we're short of power. It was not just South Africa that has that problem. In Northern Hemisphere now, going into the winter, massive shortage of power. And it's interesting, the UK, for example, has switched on coal-fired plants for the very first time in God knows how many years now to meet that demand. So it's all very well and good to speak ESG and green, but suddenly if you don't have power, we will forgo anything for that. And so I think that tells you a lot about human behavior and the behavioral aspects that you spoke to.
Glenn, earlier on,
Can I just jump in
a second, Nancy. Glenn, earlier on, Rose had started to show us areas where opportunities exist for investing. So that investor of the future would want money to be going where right now?
So I think that's entirely right. And again, Nelson made the distinction between listed and unlisted space, and they are fairly different. In the South African listed equity market, very few opportunities to invest in the green economy. Therefore, the G does become important. Nelson spoke about you can't just divest from every company that does something wrong, that we most of the South African stock market, but rather engage with those corporates, improve what they're doing, make sure that the targets, the governance, and others doing better. But the unlisted space, and I think that's where Rose spoke a lot about Africa, etc. A lot of opportunities, in particular energy, renewable energy, and the likes.
Nancy.
Well, there's 2 points there. One, I will just say on the energy side, it really is also a systemic failure. I live in Texas. We had a huge snowpocalypse in which we lost our power grid, and we came minutes away from losing it for months because we didn't think a lot about both the kinds of electricity that we're generating, how we're generating it, and climate change and how it's coming together. So these two things become really important, that we all become futurist and think about how these things are impacting and working together much more effectively than I think we have. So this idea that we're turning on the coal power plants for the first time in ages because we underestimated how much climate was going to be a disruptor for us on that. On the other side of it, I just think that, again, we're heading into a productivity world that's going to look very, very different. We're sitting on 14 internet-sized potential revolutions. So we start to think about cryptocurrency. We start to think about ways in which we're generating whether prosperity or inclusion or a way of being able to distribute value very, very differently when we look ahead. So I think what we're looking at is a generation right now that are frustrated that they haven't been able to participate in the economic structures as much as the boomers have. And they're trying to figure out how to catch up in some way. So they're being thoughtful on one hand, but also feeling the race to time on the other.
I think those are important points to raise. Is there a distinction, Rose, between an African investor of the future and a Western global North investor of the future? Because there are very distinct realities that these two communities face.
I want to start with a statistic, if I may. 2017, 24% of South Africans live in households of less than 3,500 Rand. 2021, that number is 42%. So we have quite a good security blanket when it comes to how much money we spend. It might sound strange to you, 3.3% of GDP is spent on social security. Much more than Russia, much more than India, much more than Argentina. The challenge is not whether we can support people who are poor. The challenge is that we cannot lift them out of poverty. And we all know that as South Africans, and it's probably the same for the rest of Africa. And that is the challenge. So the difference between the North and South is the South needs job growth, not just growth for the sake of growth without jobs being created. Because how else are we going to lift people out of poverty? What are we doing? More people are entering poverty and they stay there. And that, for me, is the big difference, Lerato, between the North and the South.
I'm glad you've just raised that, Rose. I'll stay with you because Tilly Salvin says, greetings all. Please enlighten me on how fiscally we're going to subsidize 28 million people who depend on social grants when debt is now 4 trillion. So it's these broader macro issues that start to come into the broader equality, sustainability, prosperity question in South Africa, in Africa.
And that's why we need impact investing. And that's why we need our young people to keep putting pressure. And that's why we need retail investors to get involved. That's why we need digital, so that we can have transparency and we can accelerate the sustainable change that we need to have. We do need sustainability, but we are focusing on governance and we are focusing on environment, and we're not focusing on social. Right. We need people to have health. We need people to have education. I don't know, to be honest, how we're going to get investors to invest in health and to invest in education. I'm hoping that the data that we will generate through artificial intelligence and through machine learning will demonstrate to us the impact on investing in human development goals just as much as we invest in ESG goals.
Nelson, this has resonance with the question that was asked to you earlier. Is you manage these assets, but are they having an impact, material impact on changing the country, the nation?
Yeah, okay. So I'm gonna take it back to that point first on scarcity and abundance, okay? And I think for me that connects a little bit to the first poll that we ran, where, if I remember correctly, you said something like 30% of the people said we're never going to see sustainability in South Africa in our lifetime, and there were 30-odd% who said we'll see it sometime in the next 15 years or whatever the number was. So in that sample, you've got some believers and some non-believers, you know. In a sense, that also points to this point of scarcity and abundance. Those who say we'll never see it are thinking in the scarcity context. Those who say they see it will be thinking a little bit more in the abundance context. So what determines which of those two vectors you follow is, I think, your frame of thinking, and this comes to the point you're asking me as well, is if you see the solution to these problems through a conventional lens, which is what you understand and know of the world today, it's very difficult to see how you make a material impact, how you solve some of these challenges, and then you do kind of lean towards the view of the world where you say, we're going to be dominated by scarcity, we may never solve these sustainability challenges, and, you know, we're all doomed. If you see it through the lens of, you know, these technological revolutions that Nancy is referring to, that honestly, we really don't have the capacity to imagine in some context what solutions may come through it. Then you can start to believe that, you know, even though we don't see them now and we can't imagine them, we will actually find some solutions to these problems. In the meantime, yes, as asset managers, we have to deploy that capital in a way that is as responsible as possible, makes the most impact that we can. But we probably know that it is not going to be the answer to solving the big picture. But you have to believe the answer is there.
So there are believers, non-believers, and believers. You might as well sing about it. Okay, Glenn, I want to come back because this is now a question of the investor of the future. Let's talk strategies that can be deployed. I know in the South African case, and correct me if I'm wrong, there are new rules that have been introduced that pension funds can start being used to invest in some areas of infrastructure. There can be some allocations there. Nelson is talking about changing not just mindsets, but conventional views, the conventional lens through which investment managers look at the world. So talk us through those steps that start to get us into deploy capital into unconventional areas, do different things, do hard things.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good discussion. I mean, I want to just reference back just a bit earlier. We spoke about some stuff being unsustainable, 28 million people being supported on social grants, etc. There's actually a lot in the financial system which is not sustainable. Interest rates at zero or negative, debt levels at governments across the board, South Africa's level of unemployment, and therefore the need for this, you know, social support system. All of these are unsustainable and really, really problematic, and we haven't come up with good solutions. Rose spoke about some of the things we need to do. We also need to stop corruption, and we also need to grow the economy, and we need to grow jobs. And, you know, there's a hell of a lot more to that as well. So, yeah, I think the truth of the matter, that's where I think the good capitalism comes to the fore, where opportunities are given to people to make money, to be entrepreneurial, to be innovative. So we're going to need all of those skills brought to the table in order to create solutions, products, whatever we need to kind of solve the future challenges. And the world is in a very innovative phase, technology, and I want to talk about that a lot later. I think that's the next kind of subway, and we're going to talk about, etc. Creates a hell of a lot of that opportunity, and we are seeing that happen across the globe.
Well, let's already segue there. Nancy, I'd like to talk about really now, I want to look at the investor of the future and what the opportunities are. So in the future, what do we have? Cryptocurrencies, we have NFTs, we have different kinds of assets that are coming to the fore. How can they help to create a little bit more prosperity?
Well, I think those are going to become very, very important, because the one piece of this that I just want to double back on for a second when we talk about job creation is we're heading into a world in which the skills gap is going to be tremendous. And I know Rose knows this even better than I do, but the fact is we can talk about the jobs of the future and we can talk about the skills that we currently have right now. And there is a massive gap that is growing in that. There will be a lot of technological displacement. So to Glenn's point, we don't have sustainable solutions around that now. We're going to have to figure out, as I describe it, how to distribute productivity more effectively and more equitably as we move into this future. And when you move then into the world of blockchain and cryptocurrencies and metaverse and NFTs and all that, we can start to say, well, we can go directly to the creator, right? The person who's creating things have a way now of being able to create economic value that gets distributed through this crypto way. I talk about crypto coordination, in the sense that we'll be able to create value and distribute value different ways. And we start to imagine that we can disrupt a lot of the centralized value holders, if you will, and be able to distribute directly to one another. But we have to think about, is our data an asset? and the fact that we should get paid for being able to give data to these companies that are using it in a way so that there's a data dividend. Like there's a whole economic rethinking about how value is created and how it's distributed.
I just want to latch onto the term before I ask Rose to take it away. But what is this economic rethinking, Nersin, in terms of the different ways we can start to approach investment techniques and strategies, where we can infuse the digital, what can retain the conventional, where money can go? Because we need to think about the solutions today.
Yeah, so I think the first thing I'll say there, and I referenced it a little bit earlier, is you need a little bit more forward thinking and change in terms of regulation. Okay, that we are constrained, let's say in the institutional arena by Regulation 28 in terms of where we can invest money and how we invest pension fund money. That also limits how and where we can make impact, because a lot of the money is still forced to be in the listed space, for instance, and maybe in some senses for good reason. And it'd probably be interesting to get Glenn's view on some of these things as well. But what you want is if you're going to invest in the technologies that are going to make the changes in future, and you want to be able to do that, then you need the leeway and the scope to be able to do it. So you must be allowed, in terms of how you think about where money must go to be able to do that. You need regulators to be a little bit more forward thinking in that sense as well, move a little bit faster in terms of amending regulations and the like. The US is a great example. If you think about the US's venture capital environment. Yeah. And where money goes there, and the types of initiatives from a technology perspective that come out of that venture capital space in the US, and the opportunities that those have to make material differences to things like food production, renewable energy, all of those things. That when I think about investing and how investing needs to change, we don't really have a venture capital landscape in South Africa. It's not to say we need one, because you can transport those technologies and that innovation that happens, in the US and bring it back to address some of the problems that we're facing here in South Africa and in Africa. But I think you need a mindset shift in the way we are deploying capital and where we are deploying capital to one that says we have to do it to address these problems.
I love what you've just said, and I think that's a great segue into our next subheading, which is accelerating sustainability the digital way. I love to use this example. Before COVID-19, we all used to go to the shopping mall and press a button to get our parking ticket. Now we wave at the thing. And I wouldn't have thought about that, but it's an innovation that evolved in response to a crisis, and it evolved in real time. One day we were pressing, the next week we were waving for our parking meters. So actually the skills are here, the innovation is here. What's needed is the capital to support that innovation, as Nersin is saying, is the regulatory space that says, come on, venture capitalists, come on, private equity, go and scale up businesses, go and support what's happening out there. And somewhere this is incongruent. So how do we fix it, Rose?
Oh, my word, if I had that answer, I would win a prize, the Nobel Peace Prize. But I think let me start off with the point Nersin, you made it earlier about we need urgency. We knew during the COVID time we were in crisis, we had no choice, we had to do something. We don't recognize our climate crisis. We don't recognize it. 70% of where our food comes from on this continent is going to be heat stressed by 2050. Heat stressed. We will not be able to produce food from there. And that takes away our food security. So we need urgency. And that's why I like the term digital acceleration, because digital allows for us, because we don't have time, to accelerate the changes that we need to make to get to sustainability. So I really like the term. But I also don't want digital to be our silver bullet. That's why I say I'll need a Nobel Prize if I solve this problem. It's because digital itself, if you think about digital as a country, it's actually the internet, it's actually the 7th largest producer of greenhouse gas emissions. So we have challenges with digital. And on top of that, technology is not always used for good. It can create biases, the biases that we've had in our system and our society that can be perpetuated, algorithms that do not recognize race, etc., that could just perpetuate biases. However, having said that, it is probably the best tool set we have on top of capital to really make the change we need.
But not just that, the digital divide is a very real issue. You've got a country with what they call two economies, two streams, a first world and a third world. And when we start to embrace a lot of digital, there's a big proportion of the population that continues to be marginalized from this digital economy, adding, I would argue, to the social problems.
Absolutely. It's easy to say that we have digital available and satellites, etc., but access remains a problem for most people on the continent, in South Africa as well. Availability remains a problem. Cost remains a problem. Cybersecurity is a real challenge. Privacy concerns, these are real challenges. So, and these are challenges, they are only challenges. We can solve for these challenges, and we should be solving for these challenges. I also want to say that this notion of the skills are there, the ideas are there, the skills are not there. And I really want us to focus more of our attention, and I don't think we do a lot of that, on skills and skills
Could
development.
you do me a favor and just talk us through that nuance? The ideas are there, but the skills are not there. What do you mean by that?
I must take you back to 2017. I did a study, and we did it with Stats SA data, and we looked at various factors, and what we concluded was that if we doubled the pace at which we reskill, upskill our people at all levels, leadership all the way down to the shop floor, we halve the pace at which technology displaces us. We didn't listen then. How can I say that? Well, we still have jobless growth. We don't have growth that's on the basis of jobs. And that's because even though we have the digital technologies, what we've used it for is efficiency. We can be more cost effective. We can take speed, make it more speedy. We can take humans away. What we should be doing is combining the intelligence of these machines with the ingenuity, the creativity, the I can figure out how to do the wave. If we can combine those, then we will get exponential growth that actually creates jobs. And for that, you don't just need the technology, you need to focus on the ingenuity skills, the creativity skills, the problem-solving skills. And that, Lerato, is why I'm making the statement to the effect of the skills are not there.
African solutions to African problems, it's a terminology that has often been used, it's bandied about. How do we use digital in such a way that it solves for the problems that exist here, and in solving those problems, people start to be absorbed into the economy incrementally, year in and year out?
Also a difficult question to answer. It has to be all of us together. It has to be partnerships. We can actually unlock the dividend. You talk about, is it a social divide? I think it actually can be a dividend, and a dividend creates jobs, right? So digital dividend can create jobs, but we've got to invest in the skills. And this, and I want to take us back to the point of the skills are not just at our shop floor level. The skills are also at our leadership level. For them to have the will to move away from an efficiency mindset for the utilization of digital to an exponential growth mindset for the utilization of digital, they need to also have digital and technical skills. And let me say, if we do not do this, our skills will be stranded, our people will be stranded assets. Skills has to be renewable. We've got to think about skills as renewable as well.
Nancy, I can see you're chomping at the bit, but I just want to reference something that the South Africans here would recognize. So in South Africa, I think the most popular phrase at the moment is 4IR, Fourth Industrial Revolution. Any politician, when they talk, they just throw the word around. And we had a crisis one day where the president wanted to address the nation and he couldn't find his iPad. He literally had an emotional meltdown on TV because he didn't have his iPad, right? And that's how simplistic we are about 4IR. We think if you've got a tablet, if you've got an iPad, you're in the 4IR. What is living in the 4IR?
I don't believe in the 4IR. I'm saying I think that we're moving on to the productivity revolution. I literally think that we're moving out of the industrial era into the, why do we call it an industrial revolution when it's a digital transformation? Like, I don't even think that those words make sense. We're moving into an era where we can produce so much more with so much less. There's a company here in Austin who can 3D print a home, 1,000 square foot home, not sure what that is in meters, for $7,000 US. The typical home to build is $156,000 in the traditional way. That is a gigantic productivity dividend. When you think about vertical farming and that we can grow 10 times faster with 95% less water, with less pesticides, with less time, and we can produce so much more and be able to distribute that so much more effectively. There are so many huge advances, and this is just where we are now. When you talk to the people who are building the future, the technologists and the scientists and engineers and designers. You ask them how far along we are 1% in to what it is we're about to be able to build. We can find out protein folding. To Nurse's point, we can build a vaccine in a certain amount of time that we thought we couldn't do. The question is what creates that urgency. What's interesting to see in these 3D printed homes, they're building now an entire community in Austin, 100 homes like this. There's low income homes, and then there are like more high quality homes that are being built this way. Why? Because we have a shortage of labor, we have a shortage of supplies, and we've got a real housing crisis right now. And the confluence of those three things has now created people to think differently, and incumbents are investing in that. So traditional home builders are looking at 3D printing. Traditional food companies are looking at plant-based proteins and recognizing that as a solution. So if they can get the incumbents to look at these exponential solutions, we have so much more to be able to distribute.
3D printing, solving social housing. Glenn, I want to bring into the conversation and back to your expertise as an investor, asset manager. How can technology be infused in such a way that it starts to create for more efficient deployments of capital, broader deployments of capital, profitable returns?
Yeah, well, I spoke earlier about shifts of power between the West and the East. The other major shift of power is technology versus everything. So it'd be technology versus other sectors of the stock market. COVID was such an accelerant to the wealth of the billionaires in the United States who own these tech companies, but to the tech companies themselves. But the second challenge is tech versus the environment. So I say technology is a double-edged sword, because at the end of the day, the solutions almost certainly will have to come from a technology basis, but come with problems which have already been identified. And Rose speaks to, for example, the emissions that come out of that stuff. So I think we just need to balance it. There's a beautiful book written about us becoming too smart for our own good. And we're just whirling faster and faster and faster. So I think all of us, with all our technological advancements, are more harassed, exhausted than we were ever before. And so we presume there's going to be certain outcomes, and they may not be there. But technology is certainly critical to the future, and many examples where it's used well. So, for example, in the ESG space, the fact you can set up a drone to check that a company says they're doing A, B, C, and D is actually doing A, B, C, and D is very, very empowering and very powerful. And the one term that I'm shocked in this hour and a half hasn't come up is the concept of greenwashing, because I think it's the term of the next decade. In other words, we're all talking ESG, and 100% of assets will be run on this basis in the next 10 years. But a lot of that will not be true. A lot of that will be purported to be green, but not really.
Maybe you're shocked because we don't know what greenwashing is. Do you want to tell us?
Yeah, that's when we all say we're green and we get it and we love the planet, but we don't really, that we pretend. And remember, if there's a lot of money involved and if 100% of assets broadly are going to be run on this basis, we're all going to say we do it. We really get it. And that creates risk, because you presume you invested in a corporate or a fund, whatever, that says we're green, etc. But actually we're not. But also wonderful opportunity to those who are a little bit smarter, to those who can do diligence, to those who create the frameworks, to those that can use the technology to prove or disprove, the claims made.
Tech for tech's sake, tech productive.
Loretta, let me just make one other point here, because I think in your introduction to this question, you asked how does the capital get to these technologies. I think we can look at the pandemic, and we can think about what happened in the pandemic. It was the materialization of an existential risk. Okay. We don't think, and I think Rose made the point earlier, we don't think about whether it's climate or some of the other sustainability challenges that we're facing as existential risks. And we already spoke about the fact that, we were able to get to a vaccine within 10 months. That needed a lot of capital, which we've spoken about already. But the other thing that it needed was risk appetite. And I think that's the point we have to think about it a little bit more as well. It needed risk appetite from the regulators to approve these things, on technologies which, granted, have been around for a while, but we haven't deployed them from a vaccine perspective yet. And it needed risk appetite from us. At least all of us who decided to take the vaccine, you had to sit down there and get your jab, knowing full well that we didn't have years of testing and all of that. And it was because that threat materialized so aggressively. If we can't start seeing the sustainability challenge in the same lens, we won't have the risk appetite that we need to progress from here.
We're almost at the end of the conversation, but before we just get there quickly, Rose, there's something Nancy said, which is we need to recognize the value that exists in data, not just mining it, but using it constructively.
She's absolutely right. And you're probably going to shoot me for this, but there are knowledge gaps. And everything we've spoken about, largely the problem is knowledge gaps. And the rich and companies that have looked at shareholder capitalism have used that to their advantage. Because of knowledge gaps, what have we done? We've created scenarios where you internalize the reward, but you externalize the cost. So we need the data to help us understand actually where are these impacts, how big is the impact. We can tell you right now how much the temperature will rise on our planet, but we cannot tell you who does it. We can't say who's to be held accountable. We don't have that information. We can tell you a lot about carbon and the effects of carbon. We can't tell you the effects of methane. And methane is also a massive contributor through cows, et cetera, So the value of digital is in the data. And not just data for the sake of data, yes, because it provides analysis, it provides science, but also because it provides transparency.
And that's very important. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we've got quite a balanced panel here today, absolute parity. Let's go back to why we're having this conversation. The conversation is sustainability in the future. 50 to 100 years from now. How do we get there? Is it small steps or a giant leap? Nancy.
I think it's a giant shift in mindset. I wrote an entire book about it this past year, about moving from this idea of leadership and this old industrial era construct that was slow and closed, hierarchical, designed to build brands at scale around the world with unlimited growth and short-term profitability, and really shifting to this idea that we are all in a position, every action counts, every single decision counts. We're all leadering in real time in dynamic and inclusive and caring ways in order to be able to support innovation, experimentation, and learning for long-term value creation. There's just a big flip that needs to happen from winning at all costs to caring for each other and the planet, and being able to deploy these technologies in really thoughtful ways. Because all the things that Rose just said are true now, but they're not in the future. We are going to be able to have greater transparency. We're going to be able to have greater visibility. And so the question is, what do we want to do with all that power?
Glenn, we've been talking about a lot of big ideas. Is it going to be a lot of big ideas or small things done incrementally to get us there?
So I think the audience voted to say 70 or 80% felt it was all of us. Of course, it's all of us at the end of the day. A term that I think is a wonderful one is the concept of a black elephant. So the combination of the elephant in the room, which is climate change and what's going to happen to us, and the black swan. This unexpected event. I know, Nursing, we chatted yesterday about approaching tipping points. As we approach those tipping points, mankind will react a bit like the virus. You're suddenly in a pandemic, you have to do something, 10 months later, you produce something. Do we need to get to that point in time? Do we need to actually hit the end of the cliff before we say, oh my God, there's a cliff and there's a big, big drop thereafter? So I guess, notwithstanding my opening remark, I'm more in Nancy's camp that this has to be big. We're going to need something that's going to kick us hard in the butt to say, guys, we need to move. And that starts at the top. That starts with the powers that be, the corporates and the regulators, the governments, etc. So I'm in more in the camp of we need a giant leap, and it's going to come, but does it need to wait till we're burning? I hope not.
Have you thought about what that black elephant event would be, Glenn?
I haven't really, because unfortunately when it comes to kind of tipping over the edge in terms of some of these planetary and other boundaries, we're at a limit in so many different areas. We are so close. And so it could kind of break out in any ways. We spoke earlier about the social unrest that manifests. And when it blows, as we've seen in South Africa, but globally as well, boy, it feels like the world is ending. The world won't end in that way, but maybe that generates enough political and other energy to make some well-required and very necessary change.
Rose, the utopian versus the oblivion of the future.
Oh my word. Yeah. Can I answer the question, do we need small steps or giant leaps? We need both. And that is because we actually need everybody to be involved. So decision makers, politicians, business leaders, they can take giant leaps. But us who are the ordinary citizen, we can take small steps. So I think we have to do both. We use our data. we harness our innovation, and we build skills. Because we're going to have to make the incremental steps to make the giant leaps.
Utopian or oblivion? Is the future a beautiful one, or are we concerned?
So I'm a card-carrying futurist, and so as a card-carrying futurist, I have to be optimistic, and I am optimistic. I actually think that this youth bulge, I think that the African young people, they are already innovative. The ideas are there. If we can just create equality of opportunities, they will solve for the future, because that's the place they're going to live.
Listen.
I'll put one out for the lunatic fringe. So I think we spoke earlier about power shifts. Glenn referred to the power shifts that are happening. We spoke about US versus China. There are ecosystems in both those countries, in the US and China, of these tech companies that are building massive advantage and unassailable advantage in the space of artificial intelligence. There's many of us, and it's not something that we spoke about today. Many people believe that we will tip over in the next few decades, that singularity point where you get to a state of artificial superintelligence or artificial general intelligence, whichever way you want to describe it. That opens endless possibilities which our minds can't really comprehend in terms of how we make this massive leap. That's the utopian world. But there are also the cynics. They will say that's the dystopian world where it will lead to oblivion if we follow that path. So,
thank you so much for your time, Nancy Jordana, Glenn Silberman, Rose Phillips, Nersan Naidu. Thank you for talking us through a future that hasn't quite manifest, but one that is coming. I want to quote the words of Ida Tarbell, who says, "Imagination is the only key to the future, because with imagination, all things are possible." And that's the nub of the conversation we've been having here today. We've been discussing prosperity, progress, planet, people, all things that should lead to not just an evolved world, but also a caring world. That is what the youth of today are asking of all of us as investors, as regulators, government, and as parents, as citizens of any country. I want to say that we do not know what the future holds, but certainly it's in your hands. Let me say thank you very much to our panelists for sharing their knowledge and their insights with us. Thank you very much to you, the audience, for raising your very important and frank points that have fueled this conversation as well. Many of your comments were thought-provoking, so thank you very much for doing so. Continue to utilize the hashtag. And just note that we'll be sharing a recording of this event with you, along with your CPD points. You've been watching the third edition of Critical Conversations. It's brought to you by Sanlam Investments. We're excited that there will be a next season of Critical Conversations. It will start in 2022, and we're going to start off by looking at the very important theme: sustainability for South Africa. What does sustainability look like for this middle-income African economy? Because ultimately, through these conversations, we're not just sharing ideas, we're also talking about creating a future that we can be excited about, proud about, a legacy that we can leave for the generations to come. It's remiss of me to not wish you a really happy Christmas and holiday season as it embarks upon us. So all I can ask of you is, as you go into the holiday season, make merry, yes, but please keep safe and remember to live sustainably. Hashtag Critical Conversations at Sanlam Invest. Thank you for your time.